in front of the famous bookshelf, right? It is utterly amazing. This is amazing. This is a miracle. We will be sitting here in front of my amazing book collection while I speak to you tonight. I mean, this is something very, very special. Something very, very, very special. Folks, welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me. I'm so glad you're here to join me and have an amazing conversation. And even though it is late at night, even though it is late, it is almost sunset here in Brooklyn. I'm here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. My wife is at the movies with her brother. And because of that, I have the living room all to myself. And because I have the living room all to myself, I'm sitting in front of the bookshelf. And it's utterly amazing. And do you remember the Saturdays? Do you remember the Saturdays when we used to just do these lives once a week? Once a week we would do them. Just once a week. Not every other day, not twice a week, but just once a week we would do these lives. And I would sit here in front of the bookshelf at 2 in the afternoon on Saturday, and I would open a can of unnamed diet beverage, and I would pour it, and we would talk about the economy in the world. Then came the pandemic and lockdowns, and we were stuck, and all of a sudden you were all seeing a lot more of me, and I was debating Vosh, and I was debating all kinds of people, and here we are, folks, here we are. Wow, this is amazing. We are here. I've got so much to speak with you about. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. It is insane weather here in New York. It is about to be June, and yet I woke up in the middle of the night, Friday night, freezing cold. Insane weather. In addition to that, we had an amazing web conference last night. Cancel This Webinar, featuring Dan Kovalik, Peter Coffin. We also had the music of David Rovics, the political insights of Ernesto, a leader of the Chicano nationalist movement. It was just utterly amazing, the web conference we had last night. Music, speeches, Max the sax was playing the sax, and it was really, really beautiful. Economic reductionism, right? Economic reductionism. All right. Or economic determinism is how I've always heard it, but there you go. I wrote it down. Folks, it was an amazing web conference. Go back and watch it if you haven't had a chance to watch Cancel This Webinar. Very insightful stuff, and it was great. I mean, it was really, really great. And multipolarity, force USA to abandon adventurism. Very good. Very, very good question. We've got a lot to talk about tonight. The way we do things generally. All right. Jimmy Dore fan base includes conservatives. Very good questions rolling in. Very, very good questions. The way we do things is I give my opening remarks. And after I give my opening remarks, we do our roll call. And after we do the roll call, then I answer the super chats. And that's why I have my pen and my notepad, and I write down the super chats as they come in, and I answer them. And I answer them as they come in, and that's how we do the show. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Be sure to tweet this out, make this a bigger conversation. The more, the merrier. I'm sitting here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. It is raining and windy outside and cold, even though it's about to be June. But that's okay, because I've got my last unnamed diet beverage of the day. Earlier today, I went on George Galloway's show and gave some analysis. That clip will be up later tonight. It was great to go on that show. George Galloway is utterly amazing. I understand he's running for office now, and that is utterly amazing. He was in Parliament for a long time. He came to the United States, and he just completely ripped the U.S. Congress a new one over the lies that got us into the Iraq War. that was really awesome. And so there we go, folks. Please post out the video various places. If you have a question, be sure to send me a super chat so I can write it down and answer it in the second half of the show. And be sure to hit the like button, be sure to hit the subscribe button, and be sure to hit the notifications bell. I notice a lot of people have not been getting very many notifications lately, so be sure to click that notifications bell. Just hammer that notifications bell, because we want you all to be getting notifications, because the more people that come and watch this program and watch what we do here, the happier we're going to be. All right. Debate other libertarian. Debate young Grippa. All right. Grippa, libertarian. It'll be great, folks. So, all right. So, folks, does Lenin say productive forces can only be built after the Lenin says productive forces only built after expropriation. Anti-China. All right. And the capitalists need the working class. Working class doesn't need the capitalists. We don't need the capitalists. All right. Very good questions. Very good questions from everybody. I look forward to engaging with all of you about them. Sekou Touré. All right. All right. Okay. All right. Just started a company officially called Unnamed Beverage Company. But it's not Unnamed Diet Beverage Company now, is it? Aha. Very good. Very, very good. But anyway, folks, so, all right. Socialism in Mozambique. All right. Socialism in Mozambique. All right. Very, very good. Great stuff, folks. Great stuff. So, folks, you may be under the impression, like many people are, like I was, that Marxism is a utopian philosophy. That's what we learn in school. That's what I learned in school. I learned in school that Marxists are these people who want the whole world to be totally fair. They want everyone to get paid exactly the same. They have this theory about how to make the world totally fair. And it doesn't work in practice. It's never worked before. It leads to this brutal dictatorship. Everyone gets to be poor, etc. And it was through actually studying Marxism that I learned that that is not remotely, in any conceivable way, what Marxism is. And I often would have this conversation with people, because people would tell me very often, they would give me this standard response to communism. I would say that I was a communist, and they'd say, I studied communism. No, they didn't. And I came to this totally original, unique conclusion that the problem is human nature. And if everyone shares everything, there's no incentive to work, and it just doesn't work. And this is like my original idea that I totally thought up on my own. And I would proceed to argue with people and say, you simply do not understand what Marxism is. Marxism is a science for understanding how society works and how history advances. And Marxism argues that history is driven forward by contradiction. And that these contradictions in history, these clashes, lead to advances, and that human history is advancing from one stage to another stage. We were hunter-gatherers first. We went from there to feudalism and slavery, and from there to capitalism. and eventually to socialism. And our understanding is that capitalism, a system of production organized for profit, has inherent contradictions and flaws within it. That the capitalist is constantly trying to increase his profits, and that leads to driving the living standards of the workers down. The capitalist is not functioning on the basis of what is good for all of society. Malcolm X. Split. The capitalist is not functioning on the basis of what is good for all of society. Rather, the capitalist is functioning on the basis of maximizing his own profits. New normal and Malthusianism. And this leads to a highly irrational society in which the living standards continue to go down, where abundance creates poverty, where the more efficient technology becomes, the poorer people get, where living standards go down despite the fact that technological advancement and human efficiency are going up. And as a result of that, this contradiction can ultimately be resolved by society as a whole, the people, taking control of the means of production, the banks, factories, major industries, centers of economic power, and organizing them for public good and not profits. And that will resolve the contradictions of capitalism and allow growth to continue. And with the means of production, no longer held back by the irrationality of greed. Growth will no longer be restrained and limited, and human technology and creativity and advancement can go and soar to greater heights, and we can eventually get a world without inequality, a world without any scarcity, a world without the need for a state or for coercion, from each according to their own ability, to each according to their need. Worships Chomsky and bread tubers, and quotes to attack tankies. All right, Chomsky. All right. Now that is the Marxist method. We're not sitting here wanking about how to build a utopia. Rather, we are analyzing the world using the science of dialectical and historical materialism. And with that science, we can often predict things. We can see things coming that others cannot see. In the lead up to the 1930s Great Depression, the 1920s, they widely repeated the phrase, Ford has overtaken Marx. This was a widely proclaimed phrase. Henry Ford has overtaken Marx, that the assembly line production was so efficient that there would not be economic crises, that because Henry Ford was paying his workers more than other employers historically had, because of that, it became necessary they argued, it became possible that the chaos of the market was eliminated and that growth could be unlimited. Term limit's useful, all right. Growth could be unlimited. Capitalism would just continue to churn out a greater living standard, more efficiency. And the Roaring Twenties would continue forever. Writing all of these down. Trotsky's Transitional program. That was the theory. That the Roaring Twenties had created a new type of American efficiency. That the United States was exceptional And the laws of history that Karl Marx discovered and the inherent problems of production organized for profit did not apply to the very efficient Fordian or Fordist American capitalism. But then in 1929, the US economy crashed and we had the Great Depression. And it was proved that Henry Ford had not overtaken Karl Marx, that the problem of production organized for profit, the problem of technological advances leading to greater poverty, had not been overcome. In the 1990s, when I was a kid, all the same claptrap, all the same malarkey, all the same tomfoolery was being repeated. I don't know if you remember this, right? I remember it, and I was not very politically conscious. I was a child, but I heard it all. American capitalism and growth and prosperity are unlimited. The Soviet Union has fallen, and the dot-com boom and the internet have rendered the economic crisis a thing of the past. American capitalism will just proceed to grow. I remember this. In the Clinton years, Bill Clinton had that song that was his theme song, "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow." And we were all told that the 1990s and the explosion of economic growth, the dot-com boom, proved that the laws of history and what Karl Marx had written about did not apply. In fact, there was a book published by Francis Fukuyama that they called The End of History, arguing that the fall of the Soviet Union proved that there was no stage after capitalism, that capitalist growth was unlimited, that neoliberal economic reforms that were carried out in the former Soviet Union and carried out in Latin America, that they were leading to unending growth, that the Asian tigers, Taiwan, South Korea, these countries, because Singapore, because they were capitalist countries, and because of that they were having growth while the Soviet Union had fallen, all of this proved that capitalism was no longer prone to economic crises. And then, after the dot-com boom burst, and thank you, Jason, I'm glad you liked my appearance. After 9/11, we started to see a decline. There was a lot of Americans who lost their jobs. There was a downturn on Wall Street. George W. Bush got on television, and he said, if you want to defeat Al-Qaeda, you've got to go shopping. One must go shopping to defeat the terrorists, to defeat Al-Qaeda. One must go shopping. And there was an economic downturn. And then the 2004 election came along, and many of you will recall that Governor of California and movie star Arnold Schwarzenegger told the American people, "Don't be an economic girly man." That's what he said. That is a direct quote from his speech to the 2004 Republican convention. Arnold Schwarzenegger said that Democrats were predicting that the economy would get worse, and he said, "Don't be an economic girly man. Don't be economic girly man." I don't think he said "an." I think, he's got the German English or whatever, and I think he forgot the "and" part. It was, "Don't be economic girly man." And we were told we should not be economic girly man, and we should not predict that the economic crisis would continue. And then you'll notice that around 2007, we all learned a new word: subprime mortgage. And then we learned another word: derivative. And then just in time for the 2008 election, the U.S. economy came tumbling down. There was a crash. Bear Stearns got bailed out. The American people got sold out. Wall Street tanked. The economy went into the gutter. And all those people who had told us that Bill Gates had defeated Karl Marx just like Henry Ford had defeated Karl Marx in the 1920s, were proved wrong. They were proved wrong. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, who claimed that we should not be economic girly men, his sheer masculine grit was not enough to save the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy still came crashing down. And some people did see it coming. There was a book published by some German communists in the Marxist-Leninist Party of Germany. And they published a book. I think I've got it here, if I'm not mistaken. Do I have this book? Do I have the book here? I think I might actually have. Do I have it? Yes, I do. They published a book with the name of a Wagner opera, Götterdämmerung, The Twilight of the Gods. Götterdämmerung, The New World Order. Götterdämmerung over the New World Order by Stefan Engel. Stefan Engel and the Marxist-Leninist Party of Germany. They published this book in 2003, telling us that a financial crisis was on the horizon. But they weren't the only ones. They were certainly not the only ones. In fact, the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist, the CPGB-ML, their leader Harpal Brar, he published a book called Imperialism. Imperialism, the Eve of Social Revolution by the Proletariat, making the exact same observations. A few years back, a writer by the name of Harvey Braverman wrote a book called, Labor and Monopoly Capital, making the exact same points. That if you are familiar with the science of Marxism-Leninism and dialectical materialism, you're not magic. You don't have a crystal ball. You don't have divination powers. But you are able to forecast the results of events. It gives you an ability to understand what is coming. And if you are at all familiar with Marxism, you would know what was going on, right? Why did the 2008 financial crisis happen? Why did it happen? Why have we not really recovered from it? Well, I will quickly summarize. Under capitalism, the worker only has value if an employer can make profits from hiring him. Right? Capitalists don't give you jobs just because they're great job creators. They give you jobs because they want to turn your labor into profits. And the capitalist always wants to maximize his profits. And in order to do that, he likes to pay less to the worker. The less he can get away with paying, the more he gets in profits. The capitalist wants to drive the costs of labor down, while at the same time maximizing profits. And so, he replaces human labor with technology. And at the same time that he's replacing human labor with technology, omitting people from the assembly line, the capitalist is also trying to make the human labor that he has more easy to replace. Instead of having short-order cooks that are skilled, he replaces them with fast food assembly lines. Right? Instead of having thousands of people who work in these things called bookbinderies, producing books, he has Amazon push a button and a book comes out. But this all presents a problem, because the workers are also the consumers. The products the capitalist is more efficiently than ever churning out He expects them to be purchased if he's going to make a profit. But the people he expects to purchase his products are the very people he is eliminating from the assembly line. The worker is also the consumer. And the worker is never paid the full value of his labor. And as a result, the worker can never buy back the products that he produces. The capitalist drives the worker to work harder than ever. Soon, the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism. And that whenever there is a huge leap in technology, it's immediately followed by a boom, because there's new markets opening up, new kinds of products for people to buy, new sources of employment. But that boom eventually implodes on itself, because the worker cannot buy back the product that he produces. And we now have a situation in the United States of America where the living standards have been dropping. The good-paying industrial jobs are gone. The wages of workers have significantly decreased, while their productivity has vastly increased. Automation has eliminated all kinds of workers. There is no room for the next generation of Americans in the global assembly line of production. And as a result, millions of Americans are struggling to get by, struggling to pay their bills. And as a result, the capitalists cannot sell the products. And this manifested itself in the infamous housing bubble. Folks will recall the housing bubble. What happened? Well, Americans couldn't afford to keep buying homes because their wages had decreased, because their living standards had gone down, because the good-paying jobs had been eliminated, because the rate of household debt had risen astronomically. Americans couldn't afford to just keep buying homes at the same rate. So Alan Greenspan, the libertarian objectivist, follower of Ayn Rand, personal protege of Ayn Rand, the psychopath, libertarian economist, objectivist, philosopher, deregulated lending to keep Americans buying homes, to keep Americans spending money. He deregulated credit cards. He deregulated mortgage lending. He deregulated all kinds of lending in the hopes that Americans could keep getting credit so they could keep buying things even though their living standards were going down and they couldn't afford them. And what was the result? It only worked for so long. By the end of the Bush presidency, it all came crashing down. The U.S. economy sunk because the housing bubble burst, because Americans could not afford to keep buying houses. And that is the capitalist system, right? That if you drive workers' wages down, if you drive living standards down, you eliminate workers from the assembly line, if you make production more and more efficient, if you advance technology, while at the same time making people poorer, you get a financial crisis. And we got one. We got a financial crisis. And what happened? Middle America, the American dream, the white picket fence and 2.5 children, the breadwinning American industrial middle class, the last stand of it, the last that was left of it, what hadn't been eliminated in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, what hadn't been eliminated in the 90s with NAFTA, finally bit the dust. Neighborhoods throughout America were dotted with empty foreclosed homes. You walked through Detroit, I walked through Detroit, whole neighborhoods where not a single home was inhabited. They were empty. Right? In Cleveland, I'll never forget Cleveland. I know there's people watching from Cleveland. Shout out to Mr. Russo, who's watching from Cleveland, and others. Cleveland, I will never forget how, at one point, what made Cleveland a strong city was something called the steel industry. Cleveland was a steel town, and down by the river in the center of Cleveland, there were these steel mills where people got paid union wages to make steel. But I will never forget how in the aftermath of the financial crisis, they had this great plan to save Cleveland. They decided to build a giant shopping mall in the middle of Cleveland. And Walmart and Sam's Club, notorious union-busting, low-wage employers, set up shop, and lots of money from the taxpayers of Cleveland was set up to build a special bus line and special accommodations, and a super Walmart was built, and a Sam's Club, and all these notorious low-wage employers set up shop in this part of Cleveland that was once called, and is still called, Steel Yards Common, where the good-paying industrial jobs had once been. Low-wage, union-busting employers set up shop. Walmart replaced the steel mills. That was the new American dream. In Steel Yards Common, one could go get a job at Walmart for $10 an hour and be greeted at the door by a senior citizen who's trying to pay their medical bills. That was American capitalism. That is American capitalism. And things have not improved. There's been an upturn here. Donald Trump lifted all kinds of restrictions on drilling and lowered some taxes on the rich. And that had it fixed the economy for about 10 seconds. Things got a little bit better, but not really. They never improved to what they were. Good jobs were not created. And then we had the economy tank under the pandemic, and here we are. Here we are. Here we are. They are managing a dying system. They are managing a dying system. Meanwhile, around the world, in China, where the state controls the means of production, where there are 5-year economic plans, growth continues. They are unpaving the roads all across America. Right. They're unpaving the roads all across America. Writing it down, Peru Socialist. They are unpaving the roads. But in China, they've built so many new roads. Every new corner of China has got roads. Nicaragua, a third world country that's been subject to all-out attack, it's got a socialist economy. They're paving their roads. Profits can no longer run production. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need society to come together and control the means of production. We need rational central planning of the economy so that the chaos of the market no longer dictates economic activity. We need production for use and not for profit. We need a planned economy. This is what Marxists understand. And the pandemic has revealed that more than ever. The health of one is the health of all. If the government had responded to the pandemic by saying, you're on your own, sink or swim, there would have been riots in the streets. And the way we responded to the pandemic in the beginning was a disaster, charging people thousands of dollars for getting a test, not providing services, not even having tests available, even if people had the money to pay for it. And the government scrambled to address the pandemic. Why? Why did the government scramble? Why did we have a different strategy in every state? Why did we have a commander-in-chief who couldn't even tell his supporters to wear masks? Why? Why? Because in decaying American capitalism, they're not all on the same page. The capitalists have competing interests. Small business owners and big monopolies have competing interests. Fracking companies and big super major oil companies have competing interests. What Betsy DeVos and her corporations and her billionaire monopoly interests wanted were very different from what Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and his monopoly interests wanted. The capitalists could not get onto the same page. They could not get onto the same page with each other. They had competing interests, and the state was trying to manage the interests and the desires of different factions in the capitalist class. The government couldn't get the whole country on the same page because those who own the means of production were not on the same page. The chaos and the anarchy of the market prevailed, and we fell on our face. In the middle of a pandemic, the country fell on its face. It was a disaster. They blamed it all on Trump, but it was far bigger than just Trump. It was the failure of a system based on profits, the failure of the anarchy of production. That's the situation we're in. Now, folks may ask, why am I obsessed with the concept of divisions in the ruling class? Why am I obsessed with the idea of divisions in the ruling class? Because as the financial crisis of 2008 took hold, I began studying extensively the writings of communist leaders during the Great Depression, the writings of Marxists and scientific socialists about what happens in an economic crisis, why economic crises happen. I began studying all this stuff excessively. And I actually came across a very, very dogmatic and poorly written song by Cornelius Cardu. I swear, I'm the only person in the universe who likes the music of Cornelius Cardu, and I like it ironically. Cornelius Cardu, backstory. So Cornelius Cardu was an experimental composer from the Stockhausen School in Britain. And he was one of these, he had the Scratch Orchestra, and he was one of these hippie, new wave, avant-garde composers who did bizarre things. You know, this was a big thing in the 60s, experimental composers. But Cornelius Cardu had a political awakening, and he became a Marxist-Leninist. And so, from 1970 or so until his death, he composed only people's liberation music. And I enjoy, in an ironic way, some of Cornelius Cardu's music. I know it is not good music. Ultimately, it's not the kind of thing people like to listen to. It's particularly dogmatic. The lyrics are very forced. But I enjoy it because he's composing music with very, very loaded lyrics, trying to communicate a political message. So I appreciate Cornelius Cardu in kind of an ironic way. I'm kind of laughing at myself and my own obsession with politics and economics and Marxist theory as I listen to him. One of his songs, The Lords of Labor, which is a song criticizing the Labor Party, it has a verse that goes like this: "The capitalists fight with one another to corner the market and divide up the world. The quest for maximum profits is the cause of war that puts us on the dole. Their greed leads them into a crisis which they try to resolve with a more fascist state. Our struggles against the whole capitalist system, so strike out the fascists as well as the cuts." Yes, not the most poetic lyrics, and that's why I like it in kind of an ironic way, because it's very, very rigid, I guess you could say. But what he's communicating in those lyrics is what R. Palm Dutt was communicating in his book, Fascism and Social Revolution, which is the same thing that Karl Marx was communicating in his book, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is similar to what many, many Marxists have communicated. When society goes into an economic crisis, a process begins. And that process is the capitalists battling against each other for control of the state. Because it takes some level of economic planning and centralization to end the crisis. So different factions among the capitalist class emerge and begin fighting with each other for control of the state. They all want the crisis to be resolved. They just want the other capitalists to be the ones to pay for it. None of them want to pay for it, but all of them want the crisis to be resolved. So different factions and different coalitions among the capitalists emerge. Sections of the government begin to fight with each other. And the divisions between the capitalist class become more intense as they are battling each other. They all seek to seize control of the state and use the state to implement measures that will stabilize the economy. And this is called Bonapartism. Louis Bonaparte did this in France in 1851. Hitler did it in Germany in 1933. Roosevelt did it in the United States starting around 1935. Various military juntas have done it. Park Chung-hee did it in South Korea. I'm trying to think of other examples. Who else? You have Lee Kuan Yew, who did it in Singapore. You have various, Perón. You have various figures who will emerge during an economic crisis, representing one faction of the capitalist class, that will seize control of the state and put themselves above all of society and try to stabilize the economy using state power. And there are different forms of this. Louis Bonaparte, he built hospitals for poor people. He built railroads. He was a progressive Bonapartist, you could argue. He did a lot of progressive things. He wasn't a socialist. He wasn't a revolutionary, but he did, do a lot of progressive kind of social democratic things to stabilize France's economy. Roosevelt was like that, Bonapartism, right? He did the Works Progress Administration, legalized labor unions. Hitler was a reactionary Bonapartist, right? Hitler stabilized the German economy by putting half the country in prison camps and the other half in military uniforms, with a prison industrial complex and a military industrial complex and mass political repression and elimination of big sections of the workforce. Hitler was able to stabilize the German economy. But Bonapartism is only a temporary solution, because it doesn't ultimately solve the problem. It doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is the chaos of the market. You still have production for profit. You have the government stepping in and throwing money at the problem, and you have massive repression, and you have massive government moves to try and control the economy. But production is still being organized for profit. So ultimately, the problem does not get resolved. And eventually, you had World War II breaking out. Eventually, you had the Franco-Prussian War breaking out. It doesn't ultimately solve the underlying problem. And most Bonapartism is a combination of both. Park Chung-hee, he was a brutal authoritarian, put homeless children in prison camps and worked them to death, right? You can look that up. In South Korea, they had concentration camps for homeless children. I bet you didn't hear about that. I bet you thought only North Korea ever did bad things. But actually, read about how Park Chung-hee rounded up all the homeless children in South Korea and worked them to death in concentration camps. Read about how Park Chung-hee rounded up labor unionists and progressives and student activists and tortured them to death. He was a brutal authoritarian. You could argue he was a fascist in that sense. But Park Chung-hee created a government-controlled steel industry. Park Chung-hee what else did he do? He created an industrial middle class in the urban areas of South Korea. And toward the final years of his life, Park Chung-hee started to stray from U.S. foreign policy, and he made the Americans very mad. And after that, he was assassinated. So Park Chung-hee, like Syngman Rhee, like Perón, like a lot of these Bonapartists, is a mixture. They're a mixture. A lot of Bonapartists are a mixture. They have right-wing tendencies. They have left-wing tendencies. You talk about the Shah of Iran. A lot of these Bonapartist figures are a mixture, right? The most right-wing Bonapartists are called fascists, and they seek to stabilize the crisis simply with destruction. You have figures like Roosevelt, who are aligned with communists and are Popular Front, and because they're so closely aligned with communists, they tend to stabilize the crisis with very, very progressive mechanisms. But most Bonapartist figures are an odd combination of both, right? They're trying to stabilize the crisis, but they can't. Because at the end of the day, the crisis is not caused by a lack of government spending. It's not caused by a lack of government involvement in the capitalist economy. It's caused by production for profit itself. It's caused by capitalism itself. And that as societies go into economic crisis, This process of the capitalist class dividing, battling other sections of the capitalist class for power. This is the natural process. And you don't know exactly how it's going to take place. You don't. You don't know exactly what different factions are going to do. You don't know exactly what will happen tomorrow or within a year or so. But you know, if you're a Marxist, if you're a scientific Marxist, you understand this process. You understand that when capitalism breaks down, this leads to an attempt to stabilize capitalist society with Bonapartism. You understand that. And with that understanding, you, as a progressive, can maneuver within it, right? You don't have a crystal ball, you don't have magic, but you do have an understanding of how this works. And I developed this understanding. I will never forget. After the Occupy Wall Street protests, which I was part of, I stepped back and I thought, and I talked with other Marxists about what could we have done better. What could we have done better during the Occupy Wall Street protests? And I determined, along with other Marxists, that the biggest mistake that revolutionaries made during the Occupy Wall Street movement was thinking that somehow we were going to be allowed to lead the Occupy Wall Street movement. There was this assumption on our part that because we were Marxists and anti-capitalists, because the target of Occupy Wall Street was Wall Street, the capitalist, because the slogan, we are the 99%, the dichotomy of 99% and 1% is a Marxist understanding of society, the capitalists versus the rest of us, it seemed like we would be able to maneuver our way into leadership. Well, we were wrong. We were wrong. Occupy Wall Street became so big, it became so massive because it was aligned with one faction of the ruling class. Sure, Fox News hated it, Republicans hated it, Republicans liked the Tea Party, that was their Bonapartist counter-gang. Occupy Wall Street was the maneuver of Silicon Valley. Occupy Wall Street was the maneuver of the big four supermajor oil companies. Occupy Wall Street was the maneuver of George Soros. It was the maneuver of the Obama wing, the Warren Buffett wing of American capital fighting the Tea Party. Warren Buffett famously got up and said, tax me more. Tax me more. In order to stabilize capitalism, it was necessary to have a higher tax rate. The big oil companies, the Silicon Valley tech monopolies, they thought that a more managed approach to the economy during the economic crisis, a more social democratic, but also a more degrowth-oriented approach might be stabilizing. And you'll notice that the fracking companies in particular, the lower-level capitalists, the Koch brothers said, oh, no, they wanted a much more libertarian approach. And so there were mobilizations. And we Marxists had it in our minds that, oh, this Occupy Wall Street is just a spontaneous uprising of the people from below. And, we'll be able to go in there and show them that the 99% is the proletariat, the 1% is the capitalists, and we'll be able to lead it. Well, that was a mistake. We weren't going to be able to do that. It wasn't our game. And no, it wasn't a democratic movement from below. It was very carefully engineered by one faction of the ruling class. Okay, I'm writing it down. Anna, after Aaron Mate. It was very much a maneuver by one faction of the ruling class. Instead of going into the Occupy movement under the understanding that we would be able to get into the leadership of it, we should have gone into the Occupy movement to recruit, to find the recruitable and good people and win them to a Marxist perspective and build our own organizations. We should have gone there ready to engage with people, ready to talk to people, ready to argue with people, and ready to build our own current. That should have been the approach. We should have never had the illusion that we would be able to take over Occupy Wall Street, never had the illusion that we would become the leaders of it. Instead, we should have gone there to meet people and win them to socialism. And we should have done the same thing at the Tea Party. Same thing at the Tea Party. We should have gone to the Tea Party. and said, we don't agree with you about libertarianism, we don't agree with you about racism and all that, but you're right, you are taxed too much, you're right, jobs are disappearing, and the problem is capitalism. And it would have been much harder at the Tea Party. People would have been much more hostile, not that they weren't hostile at Occupy. But it should have happened. We should have made that, and that was our summation. It was my summation. And about a year or two after Occupy Wall Street, Trayvon Martin was killed. Trayvon Martin was killed. This was an African-American man who was visiting his girlfriend, young man, teenager, visiting his girlfriend, and a racist fellow by the name of George Zimmerman, who was patrolling the neighborhood. You know, he followed this young man around and killed him, right? And he was acquitted in court. He argued it was self-defense. There was outcry. We first saw the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And there were massive demonstrations organized around the death of Trayvon Martin. And I noticed that these demonstrations were very, very big, just like Occupy Wall Street. And why were they so big? Why did Trayvon Martin go viral? Why did the hashtag Black Lives Matter go viral? Because there was a section of the ruling class that was supporting it, right? Because the Tea Party, and because the libertarian element and those folks were giving Obama difficulties, Obama wanted to create energy on the streets to push back against them. And the message that Black Lives Matter, that people murder African Americans and get away with it, that the demonization of black men leads to horrendous, the message really hit home. And because one section of the ruling class was supporting the mobilizations around Trayvon Martin, there were big demonstrations. And once again, I went to those demonstrations and tried to engage with people and had somewhat more success. This time with the understanding that I was not, especially as a white man, going to become the leader of the Trayvon Martin movement. I had no illusions that I would become the leader of the Trayvon Martin movement, but I went to the Trayvon Martin protests, I met people, and I recruited people. And I won people. I won a number of people that recruited the particular, joined the particular Marxist group I was with. It was a great place to meet people. And then, if you want evidence of this, if you want actual evidence of this, it is on videotape. After the Trayvon Martin uprising and the dust had cleared and all the protests around that were over, I gave a speech in New York City. It is not the best speech I ever gave, but it was called Building People's Power in New York. And in that speech, using scientific Marxism, I predicted what would happen next. At the end of my speech, I said, soon, black youth will be in the streets again. And I talked about how there was a small riot that had happened at a mall in New York City a couple weeks before. It got barely any news coverage, but that this was coming, that there was going to be an explosion soon. There was going to be an explosion of black youth. And I fit it in. I didn't put this in the speech, but I had the understanding that this was the liberal wing of the bourgeoisie fighting the conservative wing, that the anger of black people at racism, anger at the rising police state by African Americans would become the powder keg for a mobilization by the liberal bourgeoisie in their efforts to push back against the Tea Party, etc. And I was right. And if you don't think I predicted it, go back, go dig up my speech, Building People's Power in New York, skip to the end. I predicted it. I predicted it exactly. I said this Trayvon Martin kind of thing, what we saw with Trayvon Martin is going to blow up into something bigger. And I was right. First there was Ferguson, and then there was Baltimore. Now, did I figure this out because I'm magic, because I have a crystal ball, and I said, Marx, tell me what will happen? Of course not. I had the science of Marxism-Leninism. I understood that the capitalists are fighting with each other. I understood the situation that we were in. I saw what was happening with the Trayvon Martin demonstrations. I saw what had happened with Occupy. And I predicted accurately. And I was right quicker than I thought I would be. I predicted very accurately that there would be a rebellion among the black community against the police state. And I was right. I was right. I was absolutely right. But the organization that I was part of not only did they not listen to me, but when the rebellions broke out, in Ferguson, and most especially in Baltimore, when they broke out, they didn't learn anything from Occupy Wall Street. They didn't learn anything from Trayvon Martin. And instead of orienting toward recruiting those who could be recruited and not trying to take over the movement, I found myself in Baltimore. A few days before the quote-unquote riot began. And my political organization had a scuffle with followers of Malik Zulu Shabazz, right? The new Black Panther Party. Our leaders of our organization, black and white, scuffled with Malik Zulu Shabazz for control of the stage, for the control of the protest march. And they made the same mistakes again. They had it in their minds somehow they were going to be allowed to become the leaders of the Baltimore protests against police brutality. And they weren't, because these protests were not coming from the masses. These were not spontaneous uprisings, right? Spontaneous uprisings do happen, but this was coming from the liberal bourgeoisie. This was coming from Obama. They were mobilizing around the issue of police brutality because they wanted to beat back the right, okay? And there was suddenly an issue that only communists had talked about, police brutality, was suddenly being talked about on CNN. This was from the highest levels, and we were not going to be allowed to become the leaders. No tanky Marxist-Leninist group was going to be allowed to become the leaders of the Black Lives Matter uprising. It wasn't going to happen. The best we could do in that movement was recruit. And I tried my hardest. I had a whole list of people, contacts, called them, let's go to Baltimore. I got cussed out over the phone. And it became clear to me that my organization was not interested in trying to recruit and trying to win people to scientific socialism out of this rebellion, that instead they were going to try to be king of the protest cage. The ruling class wasn't going to have it, and we would be back to square one. And if you look at what's happened to that organization, right? That was 2015. I ended up going to Iran shortly after the Baltimore events, and I was in Iran, and I was on a ship trying to get to Yemen. Came back to the United States, and, of course, one thing led to another, and my journalism career took off, and I was not with that Marxist group any longer. And then they collapsed. Right? They continued this silly game of trying to take over the movement. They continued to basically marginalize, if you were a young person who was interested in Marxism and actually understood scientific Marxism, they marginalized you, but they bent over backwards to recruit a bunch of hipster woke kids who hate North Korea and hate Cuba and hate socialist countries. And, one thing led to another, and by 2017, the group collapsed. They haven't had a national conference since 2016. The group collapsed, right? Well, they didn't listen to me. I mean, I hate to sound narcissistic, but I saw the writing on the wall. I saw that these rebellions that were happening were being organized from above. I saw that our only real opportunity was to get to the masses within these rebellions and build our own organization. We should not waste our time trying to become the leaders of it. I understood what was happening. Okay? And after Donald Trump was elected president, I watched the left completely degenerate. I mean, the left was bad before, but it got worse, right? Suddenly the left was starting to refer to the millions of low-income, white working people who voted for Donald Trump, all the people of West Virginia, the people of Kentucky, the people of Alabama, just referring to all of them that they're all racist, they're all disgusting, no effort to win people in Trump's base, just cuss them out. And pathetically, not even an effort to win the Bernie Sanders people either, right? No effort to go to the Bernie Sanders people. All these people are interested in socialism. They're voting for right, Mao's China, Malcolm X. All these people that are interested in socialism even and are rallying around Bernie Sanders, no effort to recruit them. And, they collapsed. Meanwhile, I decided that it was my job to continue doing my journalism and such, but it was also my job to get to the masses and to engage with right-wingers and Trump supporters. And I debated Augustus Sol Invictus, a white supremacist, and I had a debate in New York City with the white supremacist Augustus Sol Invictus. And that was a crazy night. It was a crazy night. Right? Kamani Gray, East Flatbush. It was a crazy night. It was a crazy night. And, you know, with a camera crew, I organized it myself, and I had a debate with Augustus Sol Invictus, the white supremacist, in New York City at a secret location. He brought a bunch of Proud Boys with him. I invited a few friends, and with a camera crew, we had a debate. And right after that debate, Charlottesville happened. And Augustus Sol Invictus was one of the main speakers at Charlottesville. So immediately after Charlottesville, I released the video. I released the video of my debate with this white supremacist. And the debate blew people's minds. Julian Assange, who was at that point hauled up in the Ecuadorian embassy, watched my debate with Augustus Invictus and tweeted it out to his supporters. People all over the country watched that debate. And what they were watching in that debate, the reason they liked that debate, was because I did something that has not been done before. I used Marxism and dialectical materialism to dissect the racist ideas of a white supremacist. And instead of threatening to punch him, instead of making him look like the victim, instead of pointing at him and saying, "You're racist, I'm triggered by what you're saying," I used scientific Marxism to dissect his anti-immigrant bigotry, to dissect his libertarianism, to just rip him to shreds. And after that debate, I don't know if people recall this because his YouTube channel got down, it's like he left the debate, we were all cordial, he didn't even realize that he'd gotten his ass kicked. And the next morning, he woke up in his hotel room and realized that I had horsewhipped him down Main Street and made him look like a fool. And he screamed into his YouTube or whatever, leftists say that I'm a hater, but they hate white people. And he had this temper tantrum, realizing that he had been set up. I had destroyed him. And my audience I had demolished him, right? You watch the debate. And there's many clips from the debate where it's like he had no content. He had nothing to say. He got up there and he talked about if you have a gun, and if you get robbed and you don't have a gun, it's your fault. That's not an argument. I mean, it was just, he had nothing. Because he doesn't have anything, right? Because fascism is not a logical argument. It's glorification of violence and destruction to save capitalism. He has no argument. He has no ideology. He has no logic. And I did that. And I made it my mission to go to places where people had never heard of Marxism, never heard of socialism, never heard left-wing views, and engage with them. And I also made it my mission to expose the woke pro-imperialist current, the elements who think that all the governments the USA wants to overthrow around the world are all racist, sexist, and homophobic, and that the Pentagon is this human rights organization that goes around bringing freedom and gay rights and democracy to the world. So I fought against the social imperialists, I fought against the fascists, but I did not use violence. I used logic, and I engaged with people, and I have converted many people who used to be on the far right. You don't know how many people have told me, you know what, Caleb, I used to be a white supremacist. I used to admire Mussolini, but then I started listening to you, and I realized, wow, I didn't understand Marxism. And the way I talk is not the way Marxists generally talk. It's not. The way I talk is not generally the way Marxists talk, okay? The way I talk is different, right? I generally put forward an economic message. I put forward a message loaded with dialectical and historical materialism. And nowadays, what people think is Marxism is some guy sitting there going, bleep, 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 these bleeping corporations are bleeping racist and sexist. I put forward a different message. And that's why my message was effective. And it was effective when I debated Stefan Molyneux. And it was effective when I've debated other right-wing figures, because this is a message they are not prepared for. They are not prepared for this message. They're not prepared for it. And so it's effective. They've never heard this before. Actual Marxism dialectical and historical materialism. They've never heard it before. Because they've never heard it before, they don't quite know how to react to it. So, folks, I've just given you my resume. I've explained to you my economic understanding rooted in dialectical and historical materialism. And I've been talking to you for over an hour now, but actually, I'm setting you all up for an important punchline, if you will. Not really a punchline, it's not humorous, but I'm setting you all up. This was all me setting you up for telling you something that you need to understand. And I had to tell you everything I just told you so that you could understand what I'm about to tell you. If I had started out saying what I'm about to say, you would have thought, and you wouldn't have understood it. You would not have understood what gives me the authority to tell you what I'm about to tell you. I am about to tell you something that is very, very important. And I had to tell you everything I just told you. I had to tell you who I am. I had to tell you about Marxism. I had to tell you about dialectical materialism. I had to tell you about overproduction. I had to tell you about Trayvon Martin and Occupy Wall Street. I had to tell you all of that so you could understand that I didn't reach this conclusion because I had a bad dream last night. I did not reach this conclusion because I just thought of it while reading a science fiction book. I have reached a conclusion that is vitally important, and it is very serious, and it is not a joke, but it's something that people will have trouble taking serious. And the conclusion is this: we've got 5 years. We've got about 5 years. We've got 5 years before liberalism becomes illiberal. We've got about 5 years before fascism 2.0 emerges. We've got 5 years. And I don't even want to call it fascism 2.0, because it won't be fascism 2.0. It won't look like Hitler. It won't look like Mussolini. Some kind of illiberal liberalism will be developed, and it's being developed right now. Some kind of illiberal liberalism is going to be on the march. We've got 5 years. 5 years to get our shit together. Got about 5 years. 5 years before what I will call the liberal menace. The liberal menace is on the march. The liberal menace is on the road to power. We have 5 years. About 5 years before the liberal menace emerges. Now, when I say liberal menace, I don't mean Democrats and Republicans. Come on. We're smarter than this. We speak in political, ideological terms, not in terms of, the liberals are a bunch of Democrats, like Rush Limbaugh. No, we're talking about liberalism. All right? Infrared. I like Infrared. His YouTube channel, don't agree with everything he says. I'm sure he doesn't agree with many things I say. But one of his great formulations, he defined fascism as when liberalism collapses on itself and becomes illiberal. That's a very good definition. It's a very good definition, but it doesn't only apply to fascism. This is Bonapartism. Bonapartism is when liberalism is forced to become illiberal in order to preserve itself. Right? And there are many forms of Bonapartism. Fascism was one form of Bonapartism that emerged in the lead up to the Second World War. And it was the liberal order in Germany. It was under threat from communism. It was under threat from workers' revolution. It was under threat from continuing economic instability. And so the German liberal society imploded on itself and became a fascist state. And this will happen within 5 years in the United States. We have about 5 years before liberalism collapses on itself and becomes illiberal. And I'm predicting now, we had Trump. Trump was defeated. Trump failed. And I am predicting that within 5 years, it won't be from the Trump wing of things. It'll be more from the Biden wing of things. The liberal menace will emerge. And the liberal menace, it's very interesting. It will be the mirror opposite of what's happening in the developing world. China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, all these societies that are emerging, they're anti-imperialist countries. They're countries where the state largely controls the economy. And they take different illiberal traditions and they merge them together, right? They got communism and Marxism for their economy. They've got religion in Russia and Russian nationalism. You know, they've got indigenous religion in Nicaragua and China. They've incorporated Confucianism. These societies are mishmashes of illiberalism, right? Confucianism is traditional Chinese illiberalism. Marxism and Mao Zedong thought is illiberalism, right? Russian Orthodox nationalism, that is illiberalism. Communism is illiberalism. Nicaragua, you've got Roman Catholicism, you've got indigenous traditions, you've got Marxism. In Iran, they call it not capitalism, but Islam. They've got the Islamic revolutionary tradition. And that the anti-imperialist bloc is largely a mixture. It is a mishmash of different illiberal traditions. Different illiberal traditions smudged together in order to make societies work. In order for these societies to be free from the liberal order, to develop, a state that is strong enough to keep the society free from the liberal order, they have developed a kind of ideological mishmash of different illiberal schools of thought. My prediction is that right now in the United States, the most powerful capitalists, the Council on Foreign Relations, the big oil companies, the big banks, the Silicon Valley monopolies, they are cobbling together the mirror opposite. They are cobbling together what I call the liberal menace. And it will be a mishmash of liberal ideas formed into an illiberal movement to defeat illiberalism, as complicated and convoluted as that sounds. They will pull things from libertarianism and Ayn Rand objectivism. They will pull things from eco-Malthusianism. They will pull things from wokeism and woke guilt. They will pull things from all kinds of traditions. All of it will be merged into one liberal menace. There will be a mass authoritarian movement to save liberalism and crush illiberalism. There will be an effective mass mobilization of society to crush all illiberalism, and it will set the stage. It will be intended to set the stage for war against illiberalism around the world. Just like fascism was intended to set the stage for war against communism around the world, this particular menace, this liberal menace, this mobilization, this society-wide current to smash all illiberalism, smash all socialism, smash all religion, this liberal menace. The liberal menace will be solidified and on the march in about 5 years. We have 5 years. Right now, the ruling class is celebrating the downfall of Donald Trump and his attempted Bonapartism. Joe Biden is trying to stabilize society and make everybody happy. But behind the scenes, they are developing something that won't look like Nazi fascism. It won't look like Nazi fascism. No. Nazi fascism was way, way too rooted in feudalism. Feudalism is long gone. Feudalism is ancient history. But the Nazis, largely, as German society deteriorated, as liberal German society deteriorated into illiberalism, they very much appealed to the remnants of feudalism. Right? They appealed to knights and castles and honor and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was built into the feudal order, right? You know, you had to have somebody lend money. And so anti-Semitic beliefs were built into feudal society, right? Because only Jews were allowed to lend money, and so they were demonized and segregated. And Nazi Germany, fascism in Nazi Germany was largely, it was because the liberal order had failed, appealing to the remnants of feudalism that still existed in German society. The desire for honor, the hatred of Jews, the mystical Wagnerian stuff. That's what fascism was. We won't do that because feudalism is gone, right? There's no feudal memories in U.S. society. There's certainly plenty of reactionary ideas. But there's not feudal nostalgia. There's not feudal traditions and feudal mindsets to appeal to. So it will look very, very different. And it'll have elements of what we call the left, right? Eco-Malthusianism. It'll have the synthetic left all over it. But it'll also have elements of the right. I expect eugenics and Malthusianism will be a big part of it. I expect that Western supremacy and the belief that the quote-unquote the West is the best will be a big part of it. That's what the Proud Boys chant at their rallies. The West is the best. I don't really know what the role of this mobilization will be in regards to sexuality, and it'll probably be it'll be some odd mixture of social conservatism and social liberalism. It'll be some odd confusion. But the liberal menace will emerge. I give it 5 years before the capitalist class of the United States comes to the point that the faction that is ready to collapse liberalism is got enough strength that they overall collapse liberalism, and the liberal menace, some kind of mobilization of authoritarianism to preserve the liberal order, takes control of the United States. That's my prediction. So we have 5 years to prepare. We have 5 years to build the city-building tendency. We have 5 years to promote scientific socialism. We have 5 years to build communities of solidarity and brotherhood. We have 5 years to build a political movement that gives people who've been cast aside by this system a home to belong to. We have 5 years to get people to be optimistic, constructive socialists. We have 5 years to prepare for what will be one of the darkest battles. We've got 5 years, is my prediction. We may not have that long. We have 5 years to build institutions. To build institutions that can withstand the onslaught of the liberal menace and possibly the all-out danger of a new world war. We have 5 years. That is my prediction. And I make this prediction with authority, as I spent the first hour of this stream telling you. That's what I'm here to tell you. I'm here to give you the warning. Our work is cut out for us. And if in 5 years we have built an effective, illiberal, socialist, constructive organization, if in 5 years there are millions of people who have become part of the city-building tendency and have awakened and have done it, if that is the case, we will be able to push back. And it may be a situation like World War II, where the communists were able to defeat the menace of fascism and win the respect and glory of the human race. But if we're not ready, we could begin to see some very, very dark reality. I believe we have potential. The actions that we take, the work that we do, has a huge impact. The liberal menace is on the march. We've got time now to breathe, to organize. But the liberal menace is on the march. And we should be preparing for the fight ahead of us. So those are my opening remarks for tonight. I try to be optimistic, but sometimes I have to tell you things that you do not want to hear. And I just told you something that you don't want to hear. We've got 5 years to do our work. So get involved with the Center for Political Innovation. Get involved in spreading our message because we've got about 5 years. And on that note, folks, names and locations, I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Ryan in Oakland. Arctic Angel out in Norway. Chaya in Montreal. Keaton Mansfield in the heart of Illinois. Deep in the heart of Illinois. Clyde Bank, David in China, Nassau County, Char Char Darling, Jenny Lynn out in Cincinnati, Ohio, Tristan in Maryland, Branson, Missouri, Joey from McKees Rocks, and you can be a mod, Joey. All right, San Angelo Solidarity, Nathaniel Adams, Los Angeles, West Palm Beach, Cleveland Pirate Alex, Ishmael, Los Angeles, JT24, Tucker Marks in Springfield, Mo, Temple City, California, West Palm Beach, St. David's, Bermuda, Tamara in Serbia, Treasure Coast, Florida, Captain Waffles, I think you can be a mod. All right, Chris from Puerto Rico, Adelaide, Australia, Trevor in Ireland, Joe Gale out in Nassau County, Connie from Ontario, Long Island City, Queens, Los Angeles, Tamara and Dario from Brooklyn, John White in Houston, and I think you can be a mod too, John White. All right, Union City County, New Jersey, Northern California, New Zealand, Nashville, North Carolina, Gateshead, England, West Palm Beach, Ontario, Niles, Michigan, Nashville, Tennessee, Kendall in San Diego, Amsterdam, right? Zephyr from Eugene, Oregon, West Palm Beach, Canada, Kieran from San Diego, and I think, Kieran, you can now be a mod as well. Vinicius from Brazil, Santa Cruz, California, Nate from Sydney, West Palm Beach, Mitchell from the Netherlands, Denver, Mo in Pomona, California, Balthazar in Oakland, Charlie in Glasgow, Bermuda, Andy Fanau is in May, and thank you, Andy Fanaro, for your super chat. Holy cow, Vallejo, California, very good, Manhattan, Chicago, Detroit, Gleb, I think you can be a moderator as well. Got your email, Gleb. I'll get back to you soon. James Kane in Massachusetts, Austin, Texas, George Kraft, Leipzig, East Germany, a Tatist, Naples, Florida, Harold Sullivan. Good stuff, folks. Anyone else want me to call you out as I see you? Names and locations. Valencia, very good. Valencia, very, very good. Very good. Anybody else? Names and locations. Anyone want me to call you out as I see you? Anybody else? Anybody else? All right, folks. Portugal, Brisbane, Australia. All right, folks. So now I do have super chats to get through. I will give some long answers and some short answers, as I always do. Sometimes I hear a super chat and it gives me a lot to say, and sometimes I hear a super chat and I don't really have that much to say to it. Economic reductionism. There's a question from Chaya. Well, interestingly, Chaya, I had always heard the term economic determinism. And I believe Antonio Gramsci was the first, if I'm not mistaken, to issue a critique of economic determinism. But even Karl Marx himself, in his letters to Friedrich Engels, says that according to his own philosophy, he has no reason to exist. He has absolutely no reason to exist. Why do anything? It'll all just kind of naturally happen. Historical inevitability. And that's why we get the very important book by Yuri Plekhanov. He wrote the book, The Role of the Individual in History. There's also, that book, The Role of the Individual in History, by the father of Russian Marxism, Plekhanov. He wrote a book, and that was in response to the book Heroes and Hero Worship by Thomas Carlyle, and that the role of individuals is often very decisive. The future of mass shootings. All right. Okay. Future of mass shootings. The role of individuals is often very decisive, right? History is not inevitable. Human beings do make choices, and those choices, while they may not make them in a vacuum, those choices do make a difference. And, the belief that it'll all just naturally happen, that seems to be one of the big problems with the Marxist worldview that Karl Marx himself even recognized. All right. There you go. All right. Okay, so multiple, what is it? Multiple clarity force USA to abandon adventurism. What is that? Can someone explain that super chat to me? I wrote it down. Multiple polarity will multipolarity force the United States to abandon its military adventurism? That's what it was. I'm sorry. It took me a minute there to remember the super chat. It already has. It already has. Look, I mean, the United States would have invaded Syria a long time ago, but it's multipolarity that deters it. And I think the same for Venezuela. What's particularly interesting is that during the Cold War, in a lot of countries, you had socialist and progressive governments get elected. But then the USA, because it had trained the military of these countries, would pull off a military coup. Now we have a situation where that's not the case. The military of many countries is anti-imperialist. And in fact, in Venezuela, the military is trained in Cuba. The military is one of the most solid parts of the camp of anti-imperialism. You know, Myanmar, the military there is very pro-China. So, that reality of the Cold War, where the United States was in with the military of the world, was able to pull off coups because it had the militaries, that's no longer the case. You know, in the late Cold War, you had a situation where the United States would just send its troops, right? As the Cold War was ending, I mean, you had in the 80s, you had the invasion of Grenada, right? You had the invasion of Panama. You had the attack on Iraq, and that this was a reality. Most especially the military adventures of the United States. The USA invades a very, very small country. How did liberals compromise USSR Politburo? All right, liberals compromise USSR Politburo. And, I mean, in the Cold War, especially as the Cold War was ending, and then in the 90s, you had all kinds of U.S. military interventions around the world that the USA was not afraid to do, right? And they would attack smaller countries and just demolish them. I mean, it would be like Mike Tyson, fighting a 4-year-old child, and then there'd be this childish, this stupid, gleeful celebration afterwards, The USA, the invasion, not the invasion, but the Gulf War, is the highway of death, where the whole military of Iraq is retreating and on highways, trying to get out of Kuwait, and the USA is bombing them as they're retreating, and then they have a big parade. Yay, we won! Yeah, we got them. It's like Iraq is how wealthy compared to the United States? I mean, but the U.S. invasion of Panama, Bill Clinton's intervention in Serbia, and so many of these countries, you have the United States carrying out these bombing campaigns and, and then acting like it's just this amazing victory. I mean, they practically turn on "We Are the Champions." We are the champions, my friends. We defeated Panama. Yeah, everyone thought Panama was going to win against the United States, but we got them. We got them. Right, and everybody thought that Serbia was going to kick America's ass, but we got them, I mean, it was just it was the dumbest thing, but there was no check, really. There was no check on U.S. power, and it was like the USA with this huge military, this huge military force would go and attack, some of the poorest countries in the world and act like it was just this epic action hero movie. It was like the most disgusting thing. But now the rise of the two Eurasian superpowers has put a check on that. No doubt about it. All right. Jimmy Dore's fan base includes conservatives. Yep. And you know what? During the Bush years, Alex Jones' fan base included a lot of liberals. Did you know that? Right? The conservatives were in office, but Alex Jones was a dissident right. He was against the neocons. And because Alex Jones was part of the dissident right, a lot of liberals, a lot of people who went to anti-war rallies, a lot of, Democracy Now! Listeners listened to Alex Jones because he was dissident. And this is what happens. When you are weak, when you are the weaker wing of politics, you generally tend to have people from a wide variety of viewpoints at your demonstrations. When I used to go to Iraq War protests back in the day, I would see the Libertarian Party. I would see the followers of Lyndon LaRouche. You would even see weird weirdos that were probably neo-Nazis walking around with leaflets about the Israel lobby. I remember I went to an anti-war conference in Cleveland, and there was a shaved head guy walking around with leaflets about the Israel lobby. And it was just, the Israel lobby. And he was German. He had like an accent. I don't know where he was from, Eastern Europe or something. The Israel lobby controlled America. He's handing out leaflets to everybody with, references to the protocols of the elders of Zion. And everyone's like, what the hell is this? But he was a dissident rightist. And at that point, this is what happens. When you're on the defensive, when you're the defensive wing of opposition, right? You tend to get people on your side that are of the opposite ideology, that are just not in with whoever's in power, right? And so when the left was on the defensive during the Bush years, we had weirdo right-wingers that were showing up at our events. And we also, unfortunately, there were a lot of like clueless liberals who would listen to Alex Jones. Because you generally, if you're the defensive wing, you start to become a catch-all for anyone who's at odds with the system. Anyone who's at odds with the system, you become kind of a catch-all for them. Vijay Prashad. All right? You become kind of a catch-all, and that happens, right? And so Jimmy Dore is a leftist, right? He's a leftist. He's just kind of a classic anti-war, pot-smoking hippie. But he is at odds with the liberal order. So as a result, his message is going to appeal to a lot of people in the Trump camp that are also at odds with the liberal order, right? And that just happens, right? That just happens, right? And that when you are the defensive side in politics, you generally get people that are dissidents that are of a variety of views who kind of rally around you, and that happens. So right now, because the conservatives are on the defensive, you're going to get dissident left elements that will talk to them, that will associate with them, because, and that's just kind of be how it is, right? And that again, generally the way politics works is there is what the liberal order of the United States is pushing, and there are those who oppose it. And during the Iraq War, the liberal order of the United States was pushing the invasion of Iraq. It was pushing the evangelicals as their like core. It was pushing Islamophobia. Well, Alex Jones and all of them didn't agree with it for libertarian reasons, and communists didn't agree with it for communist reasons, and people that were liberals that were more in with Europe didn't agree with it for their reasons. And so you'd have a conference for Daily Kos, and there would be far-right libertarians and weird, right-wing survivalist people there, and there would be, comedians, and this is what happens. So right now the conservatives are on the defensive, so they will listen to anybody. They're more open to listening to anyone who's against the liberal order right now, right? Whereas liberals they have the ability to cancel people. And that happened during the Bush years, too. During the Bush years, National Review magazine banned all the paleo-conservatives, right? The paleo-conservatives, Pat Buchanan, people like that, they got canceled from the right, right? The right was in power. They were the dominant faction. So they had the ability to cancel people in their own movement, right? And they canceled Pat Buchanan, and they canceled a lot of the paleo-conservatives because they had that ability. Right? So when you're right during the Bush years, the neocon conservative faction was in power. Now it's the liberal woke crowd that are in power. So they have the ability to castigate and ban people from their movement, like Jimmy Dore, like me, right? Meanwhile, people on the right would want to hear what me and Jimmy Dore have to say. That's what there is to it, and this is generally how it works. This is generally how things work. It's in American politics. It tends to be the people in power versus the people who are not in power, and if you are not in power, you tend to attract and find yourself in the same room as people who are not in power. It's not a moral issue, right? And I would never advocate uniting with white supremacists or being part of them or trying to form some kind of red-brown alliance. That's not what I'm advocating here. No unity with racism of any kind. Right? I'm not advocating that, but engaging with them, yes. Talking about your ideology, yes. Right? Jimmy Dore has done nothing wrong by engaging the Bugaloo Boys, right? And, because Jimmy Dore is a dissident, he's out with the status quo, he's going to be more, people are going to listen to him if they're out with the status quo. People who want to hear that Biden's doing a heck of a job are not going to listen to Jimmy Dore. The people who think Biden's an asshole are going to listen to Jimmy Dore, even if they think he's an asshole for different reasons. That tends to be how American politics works, right? The neocons are out, the wokes are in, and if you ain't in with the wokes, which I'm not, which Jimmy Dore isn't, then people that are also not in with the wokes are going to listen to you. That's how it works. All right. I think I answered the question. I hope that made sense. It could come out a little confusing, but there you go. Someone wants me to debate this young Grippa libertarian. I'll debate him probably. Just send me his stuff. Send me an email, calebmaupin@gmail.com. If he's willing to debate me, I'll take a look at his stuff and we'll set it up. Might want to do it after, I've got an event coming up. There's kind of something happening towards the end of June, so, might be better to do it after that. But yeah, I mean, if he's a libertarian and he wants to debate me, I don't see why I would not debate him. All right. Lenin says productive forces are built up after the expropriation of the capitalists. Is this an argument against China? No, because you'll notice that Lenin, very famously, he said that in the 1920s, he said they were not state capitalism in Russia, but even state capitalism would be an advance over what they had. And Lenin said, they needed to have the new economic policy, right? And Lenin implemented all kinds of market reforms in Russia after the Bolsheviks had been in power. After the Civil War was over, they had a Deng Xiaoping moment in Russia. It wasn't anywhere near as successful as what they did in China, but they knew they needed to have free markets and the influx of private capital, with the steel mills and the commanding heights and banking being in the hands of the state, but they needed to have the new economic policy. And then it was after Lenin died that you had a debate in the Bolshevik Party about what to do. And Bukharin said to permanently continue the new economic policy. Stalin was for the 5-year plans and socialism in one country, and Trotsky was for continuing war communism and militarizing the Soviet Union. Trotsky was defeated. Stalin and Bukharin teamed up to defeat Trotsky, and then Stalin defeated Bukharin. And Stalin's policy of 5-year economic plans was implemented in the USSR starting in 1928. But there was a new economic policy. The new economic policy, the private stuff that went on after the Russian Revolution, before they had built up state-controlled industries. And even, let me add, and people don't realize this, but Stalin's 5-year plans involved a lot of foreign investment, and people don't want to talk about that, but it's true. I mean, how do you think the Koch brothers? Where did they get their money? Right, their father, Fred Koch, was a chemist in the United States who invented a new means of thermal cracking, which is making petroleum into gasoline, and he got hired by Stalin, right? And General Electric had joint ventures with Soviet factories, and Ford Motor Company, and they hired a lot of foreign corporations to help them set up their industries, right? They were completely state-run. It wasn't like in China where they allow these Western companies to have their own factories. The factories were state-run, but they had joint ventures where capitalists were, Western capitalists were brought in to set up and manage these things. That's why a lot of electrical engineers and architects and people, scientists from the United States went to the USSR, because they were hiring a lot of foreign technicians and labor and contracting with a lot of foreign companies in order to get things going. What the idea that what China is doing is somehow contrary to what Lenin advocated is simply wrong. All right. We don't need the capitalists need us. Well, that's a chant, right? The Wobblies, the IWW, they would chant, we don't need the bosses need us. We don't need the bosses need us, right? And that's at the end of the day, right? That it is the workers that produce the value, right? And that, the capitalist needs the workers to produce those value. But at the end of the day, if the workers were to own the means of production, they would continue producing that value. That's what that refers to, right? It refers to the unequal relationship where the worker is at the mercy, at the behest of the employer, while at the same time, it is the employer who is dependent upon the labor of the worker. Right? While the worker is the one who is at the mercy and is the weaker person, it is the worker that produces the value. This refers to the classic Marxist critique of the relationship between the worker and the capitalist. And that's the Wobblies, the IWW. That's why they would chant, we don't need the bosses need us. We don't need the bosses need us. All right, socialism in Mozambique. Well, Mozambique, what is the name of the National Liberation Organization there? Because Southern Africa, that's Mozambique, right? It was, believe if I'm not mistaken, it was a colony of Portugal. And there was a national liberation struggle was it Freemlo? Was that the group in Mozambique, right? Because in Namibia it was SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization. South Africa it was the African National Congress. Zimbabwe, you had the Zimbabwe African National Unit, Frelimo. That's right. I'm right. I was right. It was Frelimo, right? Frelimo. And yes, there was a armed national liberation struggle against the Portuguese colonialists. And then in 1975, the fascist regime in Portugal collapsed. Difference between self-determination and separatist movements. All right. Determination versus separatist movements. And, yeah, I mean, there was a national liberation struggle that ultimately got its independence, and then Frelimo became the ruling party. Now, I don't think Namibia is fully on the road to socialism. I think it's largely a capitalist country, but when Frelimo began, it was a Marxist-Leninist party. I don't think it is anymore. I think it's more social democratic. You have some places like Angola where they have built up state-run industries. But, in Zimbabwe especially, I mean, they redistributed the land, they've nationalized the diamond mines, and ZANU PF, Zimbabwe African National Union, is preaching a Marxist-Leninist ideology and is aligned with China, etc. But Mozambique, from what I've not heard about socialist construction there or anything like that. I know they do maintain a relationship with Cuba, and when I went to international communist gatherings, I think that Frelimo would be there. So, yeah, there you go. All right. Why did Malcolm X quit the Nation of Islam or split from the Nation of Islam? Well, for those of you who have seen the Spike Lee movie, you will understand that that Malcolm X became aware that Elijah Muhammad had children. Malcolm X understood them to be out of wedlock. Now, the Nation of Islam, their version of events is that they practice polygamy. And polygamy is illegal in the United States, but that Elijah Muhammad, being a Muslim, married one of his secretaries and impregnated her. But it was a secret, obviously, because it was illegal. Malcolm X did not know that he had married her, and he thought that Elijah Muhammad was a hypocrite. And he was disillusioned with his leader. But there were other issues. Malcolm X was very, very, very popular. He was very, very popular, and he was wildly popular, and he was a very effective orator. And after the death of John F. Kennedy, he was asked to comment on it, and he said that Kennedy deserved it, basically. The chickens have come home to roost. Kennedy is an imperialist. He got what he deserved. Well, the Nation of Islam knew that among black people there was widespread love for John F. Kennedy. And there was a feeling that it was better to have Kennedy than to have, the Republicans, that Kennedy was at least, somewhat friendly to the civil rights movement. And so the Nation of Islam had a line that you shouldn't celebrate the death of Kennedy because that would lead to marginalization of the Nation of Islam within the black community. And Malcolm X disagreed with that and made public statements to the effect that the death of Kennedy was a good thing. And so he was punished in the Nation of Islam. They had some, kind of democratic centralism. He was their official spokesperson. They took the line, don't celebrate the death of Kennedy. And Malcolm X celebrated it anyway, so he was punished for that. And he was already upset because he was aware of these other children that Elijah Muhammad had. And according to the Nation of Islam, this was not out of wedlock. It was just secret because polygamy is illegal in the United States. So he became very disillusioned and he quit the Nation of Islam. That's my understanding of those events. If you watch the Spike Lee movie, you hear one version. If you can go listen. Minister Farrakhan has a very lengthy speech about the death of Malcolm X from the Nation of Islam's perspective and how they see it, right? And their version of events. So, you can go watch the Spike Lee movie for their version of events, or go listen to Minister Farrakhan and hear their version of events. When I was in Iran, the question that kept coming up, the representatives of the Nation of Islam would constantly ask, did you kill Malcolm X? And they gave their version of events. And it was fascinating. For example, there are a number of chapters from the Autobiography of Malcolm X that were censored by the FBI. So first of all, the Autobiography of Malcolm X was not actually written by Malcolm X. Did you know that? Malcolm X didn't write it. Alex Haley did. Alex Haley sat down and interviewed Malcolm X for many hours, and then Alex Haley, who was a Republican, the guy who wrote Roots, he's the guy who wrote the Autobiography of Malcolm X. Okay? So the Autobiography of Malcolm X was not written by Malcolm X. It was published after Malcolm X's death. But in addition to that, Alex Haley right, who did write it, he didn't edit it. Harvey Braverman edited it. Harvey Braverman, the Trotskyite and Marxist economist, edited it. So Harvey Braverman edited it, and then they took it to the publisher, and the FBI showed up at the publisher, and they said, this is, you have to let us go through this book. And so the FBI took big chunks out of it. And it's not declassified what the FBI took out of it. So the Autobiography of Malcolm X is miles away from anything Malcolm X actually wrote or said, right? It is an interpretation from one guy that was edited by another guy that was then censored by the FBI. The actual writings of Malcolm X, the actual writings and speeches of Malcolm X, are very hard to get your hands on. Why? Because they are not widely distributed. They're owned by Pathfinder Press, the Trotskyites, the Socialist Workers' Party, militant, Pathfinder tendency. Right? Stagnation. They own the rights to Malcolm X's actual speeches, actual writings. So because of that strangeness, there are some books. Malcolm X talks to young people, Malcolm X on black nationalism, but those are what Malcolm X actually said. And the Hollywood movie, the Spike Lee movie, is largely based on the Autobiography of Malcolm X, and there are a lot of historical inaccuracies in the movie and in the autobiography. For example, one of the claims in the film is that Malcolm X, he went to Saudi Arabia to do the Hajj, and he saw white Muslims, and it moved him to tears, and he abandoned his belief in black separatism or black nationalism. That's not true. And in fact, Malcolm X was sent to Saudi Arabia in the 1950s. In the early 50s, he went to Saudi Arabia, and he's photographed with multiple white Muslims. So that didn't happen. Another inaccuracy. In the movie, they make a big thing about it's so hard for Malcolm X to become a Muslim because he's too proud to get on his knees and pray. The thing is, Nation of Islam doesn't do that. Muslims, Sunnis, and Shias, they do the salat or whatever, where they pray, right? They pray, they do the bowing thing and all of that. Nation of Islam doesn't do that. They pray like Christians do. They fold their hands. So that whole thing in the movie is not true. And there are a lot of things about Malcolm X's life that have been historically obscured, okay? That said, Malcolm X, look, he was very, very popular, and he was a celebrity. And, the rest of the Nation of Islam, there was obviously, it's been widely understood, there was some jealousy, and they were the organization of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was a spokesperson, but the leader was Elijah Muhammad, and there was some feeling, I guess, that Malcolm X thought he didn't have to be accountable to Elijah Muhammad anymore. In a weird way, I feel like it parallels the legend of King Arthur. Right? King Arthur, right? If you read Arthurian legend, King Arthur, his best pal, his best buddy is Sir Lancelot. And Sir Lancelot is much younger than King Arthur. And Sir Lancelot, not doing too well, but King Arthur meets Sir Lancelot, and together they become amazing, and they do some amazing stuff. But then there's a falling out between Sir Lancelot and King Arthur. And the result is the destruction of both of them. Right? And that this is actually a common story, right? Mentor-mentee relationships often go sour. Why 5 years? Does this coincide with election cycles? Okay, why 5 years? All right. Mentor-mentee relationships can be very beautiful at times, but when the mentee overcomes the mentor, right? When the mentor has nothing to teach the mentee. When the mentee overcomes the mentor, it can get very, very ugly. It can get very, very, very ugly. Mentee-mentor relationships are a particularly interesting thing. And I've thought a lot about that as I've studied. I've had mentors in my life. And a lot of times, a mentor-mentee friendship is not a permanent friendship. Because if you are effectively being mentored, you will grow. And you will get to the point where you're not mentable, right? And you will get to a point where and it's a problem, right? That mentee-mentor relationships are very valuable relationships. They're some of the most valuable relationships that can develop. They're extremely valuable relationships, but they don't last. They don't last because, if you are being effectively mentored, you will grow. And you will grow to the point that you will no longer need the mentorship. And preparing for that is something to figure out. And that, Malcolm X was mentored by Elijah Muhammad. But Malcolm X got to the point where, the relationship went sour. And it ultimately destroyed Malcolm X. And wasn't particularly good for the Nation of Islam either, the way it went sour. And, and there are people in the Nation of Islam who probably see this very differently. There are people who are Muslims who don't like the Nation of Islam who probably see this very differently. I don't speak for them. I'm giving you my own perspective. All right, so there you go. All right. The new normal and Malthusianism. Well, look, this idea that everyone should have less is being inculcated among the population. They are just hammering it home, and it's scary how hard they are hammering it home. I'll say that much. Chomsky, well, look, Chomsky, during the Cold War, Chomsky played the role of he was like the critic of U.S. foreign policy in Nicaragua and in the Middle East and in, Eastern Europe and places. He was the voice who could say the elephant in the room when it came to U.S. foreign policy. He could point out what the Contras were doing in Nicaragua. He could point out what Israel was doing to the Palestinians. And that was the role he played. He was kind of he gave you the other side of the story when it came to U.S. foreign policy. And at that point, you have to remember that the Soviet Union existed, and many people in the Soviet Union believed he was a household name. I mean, they believed every American listened to Noam Chomsky, and they didn't. He's described as the most quoted source in the English language and all of that, but in the United States, people didn't know him. In other countries, though, there was this impression that America was much more of a liberal and intellectual place than it really was, and that Noam Chomsky was part of that illusion. He was a household name around the world, and here no one had ever heard of him. And the fact that he was a household name around the world gave the impression that there was much more dissent and self-criticism of U.S. foreign policy at home than there was. Look, the way Noam Chomsky talked, I remember even during the Iraq War days, he was fringe. He was fringe. But he existed to kind of be the alternative voice. But now, since the fall of the Soviet Union, when it comes to the situation in former Yugoslavia, then especially when it came to Libya and Syria, he's off his rocker. He says stuff about Libya and Syria that is outrageous. He said the USA didn't want to topple Assad because it was afraid of chaos. Since when has the USA been afraid of chaos in the Middle East? He, it seemed like, if you listen to Noam Chomsky, you listen to Amy Goodman, and you listen to what the Haymarket books, ISO, Shachtmanites were saying, it all followed a specific line. Very anti-Israel, very critical of Israel, but very critical of anti-imperialist countries also. And, critical of Republicans, and it seemed like they almost lined up with the Muslim Brotherhood, right? It was Qatar and Turkey. What Qatar and Turkey were saying, the Qatar-Turkey perspective, was the perspective they were putting out, which was, they liked Venezuela when Hugo Chavez was there, but when things got tough, they threw Venezuela under the bus. They want to negotiate with Iran, but they really hate Iran. They hate Syria. They hate Libya. They're very anti-Israel, but, and they'll tolerate Hamas, right? Hamas, well, they elected them. They won't criticize Hamas, but Iran, Assad, Gaddafi, it's very interesting, right? And that I've noticed that. There's a real lineup between, Amy Goodman, ISO, Noam Chomsky. Their foreign policy line aligns with the Al Jazeera perspective. They have the Al Jazeera Muslim Brotherhood perspective on the Middle East, events, which is, it's one view. And I almost feel like that's who they're directed at. And Young Turks, if you watch Young Turks, right, they hated Tulsi Gabbard, but, they were all for Syria and Libya, but then they were critical of Bush, critical of Israel. Young Turks, right, Amy Goodman, Noam Chomsky, Jacobin, There's a certain alignment where they're in with certain interests. They get lots of funding, right? We know about Jacobin. They get funding from the Jewish United Fund, which is a pro-Israeli lobby group, but it's a liberal pro-Israeli lobby group. Their views line up with a certain faction within the American deep state, within Middle Eastern affairs. They have the Al Jazeera perspective. I've got to stop drinking soda because it's getting late. All right. Okay. There you go. Term limits. At the end of the day, I don't think term limits are necessary. Sometimes having a very, very charismatic and powerful leader who's able to mobilize the population is very effective. Look, Roosevelt, they put in term limits to make sure he could never happen again, right? And I don't know. I don't think term limits are necessary. And, it annoys me. It very much annoys me. Very much annoys me that, when they lifted term limits in Venezuela, right? They had the vote to lift term limits. All these people were saying, "Oh, they're taking a vote on whether Hugo Chavez can be president for life." And it's like, no, they're taking a vote on whether or not they're going to have term limits, right? And many countries don't have term limits. Japan does not have term limits. Britain does not have term limits. But whenever a socialist country wants to limit term limits, they're like, "Oh, he wants to be dictator for life." It's like, no, they're voting to lift term limits. Well, no, they're taking a vote on whether he can be president for life. It's like, no. They're taking a vote on whether or not he can keep running, right? There's this thing called term limits. I hate it when they lie like that. You know how viciously they lie? They lie. They lie through their teeth. Every time Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez or any of them wants to lift term limits, they'll have a constitutional referendum, a vote. That's not democratic, but they're having a vote. And in Venezuela, they lost the vote, mind you. They have the vote. When they have a vote on term limits, the U.S. media will report they're voting on whether or not Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez becomes president for life. And they are liars. And thank you, Eduardo, for the super chat. They are vicious liars, American media. All right, Trotsky's transitional program, right? Well, Leon Trotsky, when he was starting the Fourth International, which was his own international, he wrote a manifesto called The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Death Agony of Capitalism and something else, right? And it's published generally as the Transitional Program for Socialist Revolution. You can read it on the internet. It's the manifesto, the platform of the Fourth International. And the theory of the transitional program is that demands are put forward, and this is just good Marxism, that demands are put forward, that could lead to Marxists taking power, right? And this is different than the minimum program. There's what you call the minimum program in Marxism, which is just basic demands, increase wages, free political prisoners, things that don't really change the nature of society. You have the maximum program, which is socialist revolution, right? And the idea, is that, and this is just true, right, that in Soviet Union, they said peace, land, and bread. And peace, land, and bread was a transitional program. In order to have peace, land, and bread, you have to have a revolution. It wasn't full communism. It wasn't the maximum program. It wasn't the minimum program either. Peace, land, and bread was a transitional program. And if you read, I've got here, Kim Il-sung, right? If you read the radio speeches of Kim Il-sung, right? He's got the transitional program upon which the Korean workers, the 20-point platform. It's like the most interesting thing in this book is the 20-point platform. How Kim Il-sung, when the Korean Workers' Party in North Korea took power, they had a transitional program. That they took power on the basis of a transitional program. This is generally how these things are done, is they have a transitional program. Trotsky was framing it in his own way, and this fits a particular, it's a true thing, right? It is true that you have a transitional program in order to take power. At the same time, it fits one of the fallacies of Trotskyism. Trotskyism argues that what the Bolsheviks did in July of 1917 is what Marxist parties should do all the time. It's what they should do all the time. All the time, at all times, they should do exactly, what they did in July of 1917. And that's not realistic, right? There are different tactics at different times. If the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. Now, I'm going to try to finish this up quick. We got to get through some of these, but I'm going to have to wrap this up, actually, with a liberal menace, be a Bonapartist. Okay, liberal. I got to get through these fast because we're, right? We're wrapping up here. Liberal menace, be Bonapartist. All right. Very good. All right. Next question. All right. Socialists in Peru. Very exciting. Peru Libre, Free Peru. Yes, it's very, very exciting. And they've built a coalition. And you'll notice that their program is not fuck Peru. Imagine that, right? I mean, the United States, you're supposed to say fuck America and then expect people to vote for you, right? You're supposed to burn the American flag. I've been told so many times American patriotism is inherently reactionary. We're supposed to make life worse and expect workers to vote for us. Peru, they're Free Peru. They've built a coalition. Very beautiful. And why has it taken so long for Peru's left to get their energy together? Because of the damage done by the Shining Path, El Sendero Luminoso. I mean, the Shining Path, the ultra-left lunatics of the Shining Path have done so much damage that any time there was a leftist or a socialist running for office, they just point to them and say, oh, you're like the Shining Path. Well, now that has worn off enough that the left in Peru has its energy together. All right, next question. Bonapartism in specific industries. I don't know what that means. I mean, perhaps you're referring to the fact that sometimes Bonapartists will, enact like some level of state control, the enactment of, what do you call it? The enactment of government monopolies or national champions. I don't quite know exactly what that means. All right. They're going after Aaron Mate. Aaron Mate does great work. He's an anti-imperialist journalist. Of course they're going after him, right? Just like they go after Max Blumenthal, just like they go after me, right? I mean, of course they're going after him. There you go. All right. Euthanasia. I'm not for euthanasia, right? Because that leads to a culture of death, right? That leads to, reducing the population, giving people the freedom to die. Look, there's already been cases where they've given people they've granted the right to euthanasia because the person's depressed. That's called suicide, right? Have you seen this in like the Netherlands or Sweden? So no, I'm not for euthanasia. Generally, I mean, it's one thing if the person is, in a coma for the rest of their life and it's a feeding tube, but as far as, injecting people and, and killing people because they're in a lot of pain or something, I'm not for that. No, I am not. All right. Malcolm X liked Mao. Yes, he did. And Malcolm X and all black nationalists, Nation of Islam, Marcus Garvey, have a lot of admiration for Eastern revolutionaries. And the fact that the Soviet Union convened an anti-colonial conference, the Conference of the Peoples of the East, and that is widely admired by black nationalists, right? Kamani Gray in East Flatbush. Right, I remember that. In East Flatbush, Kamani Gray was killed. I went to some of those protests, and that was kind of the beginning. It was kind of a rehearsal, I guess, for what eventually came with Black Lives Matter. It didn't go national, right, but there was some street fighting and some protests. They burned down a Rite Aid, if I'm not mistaken. That was in Brooklyn. It was a rebellion after the police killed someone named Kamani Gray. That was, as the Trayvon Martin stuff was getting going in the lead up to what eventually happened. So there you go. The future of mass shootings, well, unfortunately, the way our society is operating, I think they're going to continue. I don't like them, and I think it's a problem of our society. It's a disease of the decay of our society. Much like, the British Empire and Atlanticism spawned the horror of serial killers, we now have mass shootings as the horror of capitalism. All right. Liberals compromise. How did liberals compromise the USSR's Politburo? There was a huge effort to court the USSR, right? You had, the stores where you could buy Beatles albums and blue jeans. You had the cultural stuff going on. You had seeping into the Marxist movement, the influence of liberal academia, etc. You had the belief that Noam Chomsky was a household name. You had the nuclear power protests that were, all of these things. All right. Vijay Prashad, he's a great writer. I've seen him speak at events around Venezuela and other things. I haven't read any of his books, unfortunately. He's one of the Marxist writers. I haven't studied his books. I've read a number of his articles. I like that he talks about events in India in a great way. He upholds the legacy of the Soviet Union and the role that they played in fighting racism, etc. So there you go. All right. The difference between self-determination and separatism. Well, self-determination means that the oppressed people have the right to decide. They have the right to decide, right? Means they have the right to decide, right? Separation is the belief that there needs to be a separate government. And there can be separate movements that are not, it's just, look, if California wants to break away, that's a separatist movement. There's no California nation. It's just California wants to become a separate country. A separatist movement is about making a separate country. Self-determination means that a nation, a colonized people, start making decisions for themselves. Okay. Stagnation in the USSR. Well, stagnation in the USSR is about the fact that look, there in the 80s, the USSR needed to change their system. They needed market reforms and such, but they didn't have an economic collapse. There wasn't mass unemployment and such. That didn't happen until the fall of the Soviet Union. There was full employment. They were still growing as an economy, but the growth slowed down in the 80s, largely because of some of the problems that you have with a totally state-run economy. All right, why 5 years? It is related to the election cycle. It's related to what they're trying to do now to nail the door shut around Trump. It's related to the confusion on the right. They have to totally defeat and demolish what's left of Trump, and then they have to start making alliances within the liberal camp. It'll take them a while. They need to defeat Trump. They need to stabilize society enough, that they can feel safe to start doing it. But the liberal menace is coming. Watch my clip of Caleb going over the British Empire Jack the Ripper. Yeah, check it out. It's on his channel. I've talked about that many times. Will the liberal menace be Bonapartism? Yes, it will be a form of Bonapartism. It will be one section of the capitalist class building a mass liberal mobilization to save capitalism with mass destruction, and it's coming. And it won't look like fascism, and it won't look like progressive Bonapartism. It'll be its own thing. It'll be a new formation to save capitalism, and it's frightening. And we have 5 years to mobilize against it. And on that note, folks, we are done. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, thank you, Gleb, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.